All right, we are live. I will now pass it off to Shama Sawant. Thank you all for attending, and she will start us off for this People's Budget Town Hall.
Good evening. Thank you everyone for coming. This week, the New York Times reported that the United States has surpassed 8 million known cases of COVID and is scarily headed towards its third peak. We're seeing US cases trending upward in 41 states over the last 2 weeks, and epidemiologists are saying that the extent of COVID infections is reaching uncharted territory. There's no question this pandemic has taken and continues to take a massive, untold toll on so many of us, and it has worsened a deep and long-standing crisis in the global capitalist economy. But the key question is who's paying and who's going to pay in the future for this pandemic and the economic collapse that has happened around us? That is the central question that is underlying this year's city budget and why we should be building the People's Budget movement. And we're going to have many speakers here who will share with us their thoughts as to why we should be doing this. It's really great to have you all at the People's Budget Town Hall. We can't do this in person as we have done every year since we were elected in 2014 and took office in 2014. But we're doing this online and we are building this movement nonetheless. I especially wanted to give a warm welcome to the many of you who are joining us for the first time. Welcome. I wanted to invite Logan Swan now to make some opening remarks. Logan Swan is an iron worker. He's a member of Iron Workers Local 86. Logan was also an integral part of helping to lead the Tax Amazon movement. Welcome, Logan.
Hi, yeah, my name is Logan Swan. I'm a rank and file union iron worker at a Local 86 Seattle. And yeah, I mean, the combined disasters that working people are faced with is not a new experience, but instead it's the escalation of already familiar failures of capitalism to meet human need. Working families have been in a silent crisis for more than a decade of economic growth and expansion because the fruits of our labor have been stolen by the 1%. Much like we're being told now that, you know, we're all in this together. We were told last time that we must all tighten our belts. Many of us remember the doldrums of the last recession, you know, shaking our heads in disbelief when we're told that the economy had recovered. Still being foreclosed on, still being evicted, still broke, still unable to find steady work. Recovered for who? You all probably know, but I'll say it anyway. You know, it was recovered for the bosses, for the owners. The immense wealth of the capitalist class has literally rocketed into space even faster than our rents and debts as we struggle to make ends meet. The talking heads hail our recently departed longest period of economic expansion as some kind of success. But this was the only economic recovery in history to have seen zero gains for the working class. For us, the return to work was for low-wage jobs, often more than one. Youth were told that, you know, higher education was the way to get ahead, but instead found their heads underwater as they began independent life, drowning in predatory loans. Most of us have done the renter shuffle of moving after every lease because your rent goes up, or taking on new roommates as our homes get divided among more people, like our time gets divided by more jobs and our paltry wages get divided by more debt. Construction workers like myself, we build the shiny buildings for the bosses of Amazon and other corporations, but we don't make enough to afford to live in the city that we build. You know, you're probably thinking, man, that sounds really depressing, Logan. You know, you socialists aren't any fun. But, you know, fortunately, despite the Armageddon skies last month, I think that seeing all of us at this event right now should give us cause for optimism. Black Panther Fred Hampton said, "Peace to you if you're willing to fight for it." I see a bunch of fighters here ready to get organized. Just months ago, we saw over 20 million out on the streets of America in multiracial solidarity against racism and police violence. And we forced a historic concession from the billionaires and the political establishment when we won the Amazon tax during the height of the Justice for George Floyd movement. As I said before, youth were told that they could individually secure comfort and stability by going to college and getting a better job. But if we look to history, as well as our recent victories of a $15 minimum wage and a tax on Amazon and big business, the clear truth is that the only way to improve our conditions is through collective struggle. Unfortunately, while we see workers and youth taking heroic action in our workplaces and in the streets, we aren't seeing many in the union leadership taking up these fights. It is up to us to organize our neighborhoods, our communities, and our workplaces in combating austerity and fighting for a budget that's based on the needs of the majority and not big business. And to my union sisters and brothers, we have a campaign to lead in the labor movement to develop our organizations into the institutions of class struggle that they're meant to be. It's up to rank and file union members to push for a class struggle approach. And it's up to union leaders who support their members organizing, as we see in the public sector unions like WFC 1488 and UAW 4121. We're under attack, and not just from the individual greed of Jeff Bezos, although, that's obviously massive, but from the entire capitalist class as their economic house of cards collapses under the weight of its own contradictions. Much like workers cannot afford market housing, humanity cannot afford a global market economy that requires infinite growth. It's stripping our planet bare of the ability to sustain us. We saw at the state level back in May that the Austerity Acts, it hit funding for the environment and education first. And now in Seattle, they want to cut affordable housing and public transit. We cannot accept more cuts. We cannot accept a new normal where government funds nothing but police repression, because that's exactly what will happen if we do accept these cuts. Next year, we'll be faced with more, and then more in the years after that. We need a budget that provides us with quality, affordable housing and good union jobs, one that addresses the climate catastrophe we're experiencing, as well as the legacy of brutal systemic racism. The ruling class and its democratic establishment, they weren't making hay on this one, the sun was shining. And now when the smoke chokes the sky, they're trying to make us pay for the failure of their system. The clock is ticking, and we cannot afford incremental change to the convenience and comfort of those in power. And we certainly cannot retreat from the needs of the objective situation. We must fight like our lives depend on it, because they do. We're dying from COVID. We're dying from wildfires and hurricanes. We've been dying from, endless wars and the unsafe workplaces of the bosses. And this is what compromise and waiting on the political establishment has gotten us. The way forward is through understanding our collective strength as those who make this city run, and demanding that our needs be put ahead of the profits of the wealthy. So I'm very excited to be here with you all in this struggle for a city that puts us first. And now let's get organized, let's smash austerity, and let's win a people's budget.
I want to thank my union brother Logan for his inspiring open remarks, setting the context for our 2020 People's Budget movement. And as he said, it really is true that we are fighting not just to win legislation for next year, but to take on big business and the billionaires who are demanding that we pay for their crisis. For years before our socialist office existed in City Hall, the annual city budget was largely a game of inside baseball for the political establishment. City council members met behind closed doors, made compromises with one another. They even took a break during the budget season, and this is true. They took a break during every budget season to attend an annual several-day retreat at Suncadia Resort, hosted by none other than the Chamber of Commerce, where they rubbed shoulders, sipped wine, and shared food with corporate executives from throughout the area. And you can only imagine what happened there. But the biggest scandal was that these council members spent $10,000 of taxpayer money every year for this junket. Our inaugural People's Budget press conference in 2014 exposed this scandal to the light of day, and that put a permanent stop to this. That was the very first People's Budget victory. We brought a fundamentally different approach from City Hall's business as usual by organizing working people and diverse communities from outside City Hall, to bring pressure to bear on the political establishment, to show our power through collective action, not relying on private conversations between me and other politicians. We brought together working people, young people, elders, faith activists, union members, housing justice activists, immigrants, LGBTQ community members, Black and Brown community members, and small business owners. We united, organized, and fought for bold budget demands because we recognized that the final budget isn't a product of sensible debate about data or where rational arguments carry the day. Rather, it is absolutely a power struggle between the political establishment and big business on the one side and ordinary people, working people on the other. We brought a fighting working class socialist approach, and that is the People's Budget. And so many, regardless of whether they consider themselves socialist, regardless of whether they're members of a union or not, have joined this struggle because they recognize that it's when we unite in the grassroots that we can win concrete victories. Our People's Budget movement is a shining example of that kind of united approach. It has a 6-year track record of having won crucial victories. We've won tens of millions of dollars for affordable housing, breakthrough funding that didn't exist before for renter organizing and defense, homeless services, and tiny houses. Let's continue building that movement this year. We also won the Indigenous Peoples Day by organizing some of the same forces on the ground. We won funding for Vietnamese seniors and marginalized communities. We won funding for restorative justice for our youth. Last year, we won over $500,000 for that purpose to replace the racist courts and jails. Today, the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated the capitalist crisis that Logan spoke about. Nationally and globally, the economy is in its deepest economic crisis since the Great Recession. Unsurprisingly, and no less shamefully, Seattle's political establishment, led by Mayor Jenny Durkan, is now trying to make workers, renters, and struggling homeowners and small business owners pay for the costs of this crisis on top of the crises we already face. Mayor Durkan's proposed budget attacks working people. That's why we have to demand the City Council do the right thing. We will look at all the numbers tonight. We will have many speakers who will help us understand what we can do and why we need a people's budget. But I will just say that we need to raise the Amazon tax that we won earlier this year to eliminate all of the Durkan proposed cuts to housing and other services, cuts to community centers and parks and transit. We need to fund the fight against displacement and inequality. We need to build more tiny house villages, which have a tremendous evidence that they work the best as an interim solution for homeless people. We are fighting for all kinds of tiny house villages, including self-managed ones like Nicholsville and Share. We need to add $500,000 to organizations like Tenants Union and Be Seattle for renter organizing. We need to add $700,000 so that the Housing Justice Project can provide free city-funded attorneys to help prevent cruel evictions, purchase a hotel to, fund Lehigh to purchase a hotel to provide 100 rooms for homeless people during the COVID crisis and after, and cancel all the public utility payments for low-income renters and others who've lost their jobs because of the COVID and the recession crisis. And all of that, we need to fund these renters' rights because all of that is going to help build the movement to cancel rent, mortgage, and utility payments. And we have speakers who will go into that in more detail. And last but not least, we need to defund the bloated police budget and put that money into urgent community needs for Black and Brown working class and poor people. And very importantly, we are demanding that the City Council take the first steps for a democratically elected community oversight board with full powers over the police, a board that is going to be directly accountable to voters and will have the opportunity, but also the responsibility, because if they don't, we can vote them out, to hold police accountable. They will have full powers, including hiring and firing and subpoena powers. We will have more on that in a bit. It will not be easy to win any of these demands. We don't have illusions. We are up against the business as usual political establishment, even though they use different language this year. We saw 6 of the 8 Democrats talked about defunding the police by 50%, nonstop in the summer, but not one of them supported our people's budget proposal from my office to actually accomplish that. So, we make a distinction between words and actions. If you are a politician with the power to actually make change and save lives, your words are of no value. Your actions have to prove that, and you have to be willing to take the heat from big business and the establishment. If you're not willing to do that, then you are not really representing the interests of ordinary people. But as Logan mentioned, as many of you have seen yourselves with your experience, if we get organized, we have shown that in the past, people's budget battles we can win. And I will just mention, in addition to the people's budget, just this year, in January, actually, we won a ban on winter evictions, the first of its kind in America. This is huge. And during the Justice for George Floyd movement, despite attempts by some council members to drive through truck-sized loopholes, we won without that loophole. We won the first in the nation legislation to ban police use of tear gas, rubber bullets, and other so-called crowd control weapons, which, by the way, have historically also been used brutally against workers on strike lines. And just a few months ago, we won the historic Amazon tax to fund affordable housing and the Green New Deal. And while doing all of this, our Socialist City Council office has also stood up for workers organizing for workplace justice, from the Elliott Bay Book Company to Swedish Medical Center to the University of Washington to Uber and Lyft drivers. In the wake of the historic George Floyd movement, many are getting active in fighting for a humane budget that works for working people. So our office and Socialist Alternative are proud to be among the more than 100 organizations signing on in support of what is being called a solidarity budget. The people's budget is in solidarity with the goals of the solidarity budget. We all want to defund the police by at least 50%. We want real community say in the hundreds of millions of dollars and how they should be used, and that they should be used for our Black and brown communities, not to continue the status pro big business status quo. We want to increase massively the amounts of permanently affordable housing to fight gentrification. And for that, we need to increase the Amazon tax and also to stop the cuts. The key question here, sisters, brothers, fellow activists, is one of strategy. How can we actually win these demands? Because it's not enough to make the demands. We have to win those demands, because that's what makes real change in people's lives. So what does our experience show about what strategy and tactics work? We've shown through a 6-year track record, with people's budget being a fighting movement that has won so many landmark victories. And in addition to the ones I mentioned, we also won. We've also won $29 million for affordable housing on the back of the Block the Bunker movement in 2016, and many of you were part of that as well. So based on all of that experience, we believe that the best chance of winning is for all of us in the grassroots to unite around a fighting approach that relies on the strength of our movement and not on the promises by politicians or by the words uttered by them or the negotiations that they conduct behind closed doors. If we use this fighting approach that we have used in the past, then we have a shot at making history and defunding SPD by at least 50% and pushing back on the cuts and actually funding our needs. And by doing that, we will also show an example to the millions around the country wanting an example of how to do the same. People will ask us, how did you do this? We want to learn how. And that's happened every time we have won a victory. And this is precisely what scares the Democratic establishment and big business so much. And that is why they will always fight us hard to prevent us from winning any victories. And that is exactly why we need to get organized, because we need to change the balance of power in the favor of ordinary people and the marginalized, away from the already powerful. So I'm now going to turn to Jonathan Rosenblum, who is a community organizer in our council office, who will go through a brief explanation of the mayor's budget, very bad budget, before we turn to the specifics of what we are fighting for in the people's budget. And we'll hear from many community members. I want to thank in advance everybody who is going to speak at what's going to be a dynamic town hall. And then we will conclude the meeting by going over specific action steps, because it's not enough to show up tonight. We're going to have to build this struggle over the next 5 weeks to beat back the mayor's austerity and win a people's budget. Jonathan, take it away.
Thanks very much, Shaman. It was really inspiring to hear both from you and from Logan at the beginning of the meeting. I'm going to set up the screen sharing here in just a moment, and we will begin our slideshow. One moment. That's not it. Give me just a second here. I'm sorry. Okay. Here we go. There are a number of people presenting tonight, and you'll hear from several of us in the council office, but most importantly, you're going to be hearing from community members about how we're organizing and fighting for people's budget. First of all, just to review for people's benefit, the budget is an annual budget in the city of Seattle. The general funds, the amount of money the city has as in its discretion to spend is around 1.4 billion. Most of it's from regressive taxes, although as Shaman noted, we won the historic Amazon tax earlier this year. That is tilting the taxes a little bit in the right direction, but not nearly enough. Now, every fall, the mayor proposes and the council enacts a budget for the following year. This year, the mayor proposed the budget on September 29th, and we're in deliberations now, and the council will adopt a budget for 2021 by November 23rd. Mayor Durkan's budget, as you've heard, places the burden of the pandemic and the recession on the backs of working people and marginalized communities. And we wanted to go into some detail with you tonight so that you could see exactly what we're talking about when we say austerity budget. And don't worry about taking a lot of notes. At the end of this evening, my coworker Sasha is going to point you to a website where you can access this full presentation for yourselves after tonight. Mayor Durkan's budget promises to fund $100 million for Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, but simultaneously cuts over $200 million in parks, community centers, libraries, transit, impacting the same communities the most. In fact, she takes $30 million that was dedicated to fight displacement and puts it into covering her budget deficit. The mayor's budget fails to defund the bloated police budget. It fails to take steps to stop gentrification in the central districts and elsewhere, and actually cuts affordable housing funds. And it fails to stop the cruel, inhumane, and ineffective sweeps of our homeless neighbors. I'm going to show you a couple slides demonstrating the specific cuts that we're seeing in the mayor's austerity budget. The mayor, as I noted, is cutting $30 million that she promised last year for a strategic investment fund to address displacement. That money is gone. She's proposing to cut $49 million from affordable housing, including $35 million reduction from funding for new affordable housing construction. And she's cutting funding for the Green New Deal, including cutting funding for the community-led Green New Deal Oversight Board and funding for Seattle City Lights conservation initiatives. As if that's not nearly enough, she's cutting more. The mayor is proposing to cut $5.8 million from libraries by cutting funds by cutting hours and services in our public libraries. Let's go to that slide. She's cutting $41 million from parks and community centers by closing community centers and by closing pools. And she's cutting $117 million from transportation, including cuts to buses and the construction and maintenance of Seattle's streets. That is, in sum, what the mayor's 750-page budget document boils down to: austerity for working people and a continued tax haven for the rich and the powerful. And again, this presentation is going to be available to you online after tonight's presentation. But what we want to do right now is turn to the people's budget itself. And as you've heard, the people's budget is our counterweight to what the mayor and the political establishment are trying to do. We have spent the last several months in conversations with many of you in many different ways and places to talk about what we needed to fight for in the people's budget. And the amendments that you're going to hear about that Chama has put forward on behalf of our people's budget movement tonight are amendments that will make this budget a budget that serves working people and not big corporations. Before we go through all the people's budget demands, though, I want to note a couple of things about fighting budget cuts and making big business pay. We know we just won this historic victory to pass the Amazon tax just this past summer. But one of the proposals in our people's budget this year is to increase that Amazon tax incrementally in order to stop the austerity and fund human service needs. We also are proposing to cut the police budget in half, as the community has called for, to defund the SPD. And I'm going to go through a few examples when we talk about big business and Amazon. Exactly who are we talking about? When we talk about the SPD budget being so bloated, what exactly are we going to be talking about? So I'll be introducing this topic with a few slides, and then we're going to hear from a couple of community leaders, David Parsons and Joe Segru from UAW 4121. But first of all, let's take a couple of minutes and meet the pandemic profiteers in Seattle. Let's move to the next slide. One moment, please. My screen share is moving slowly, so if you'll just bear with me for a moment, we'll be right with you. There we go. So who are we talking about when we talk about big business? Obviously, we're talking about Amazon, but we're also talking about other businesses as well in the Seattle area. One of them, and I'm going to try to move to the next slide, but again, the screen share is a little blocky on this end, is Starbucks. Starbucks, how are they doing this year with the pandemic? Well, they've seen a 14% increase in shareholder dividends in the last year. Their stock prices have at this point entirely recovered from the pandemic, and CEO Howard Schultz is himself, as an individual, worth $4.3 billion today, which is an increase of 39% in just the last 4 years. That's an example of a company that is making billions of dollars through the pandemic, and they're right here in the community. And by the way, they have also laid off many, many workers during this pandemic. A second company I wanted to highlight for you is a company maybe people don't know as much about, but it recently established headquarters in downtown Seattle. It's F5. It's a software security firm. They have seen a 43% growth in software revenue just in the 3 months following the initial peak of the pandemic. And it's $134 million in overall profits during that period. And then here's another example of a pandemic profiteer. Some of you may have heard of Salesforce based in San Francisco, but they own a company called Tableau here, another high-tech company that is based in Seattle. And next slide. One moment, please. I'll just start describing. So Tableau and Salesforce in the 3 months, April, May, and June of 2020, while the community was ravaged with the pandemic, reported one of the best quarters in Salesforce's history. The New York Times reported surging revenue and profit up 29%, and profits of $2.6 billion just in the 3 months, April, May, and June of this past spring. And then, of course, we can get to Amazon, which is the biggest company by far, but again, certainly not the only one when we talk about big business. Amazon has experienced what the media are calling record-shattering profits thanks to the pandemic sales. Between April and June 2020, Amazon's profits were $5.2 billion, a new record for this company. And today, CEO Jeff Bezos is worth $191 billion, which is up 66% in just the last 10 months. Think about that. Has your wealth increased 66% by billions and billions of dollars in the last 10 months? Well, Jeff Bezos's has. One moment, please. We'll go to the next slide. There we go. And here's a clip just from today's newspaper that reports, that reports that during the pandemic, between March and October of this year, U.S. billionaires saw their net worth rise by almost $1 trillion. It is absolutely staggering. So, of course, there's no crisis if you're Jeff Bezos. There's just a crisis if there's a crisis for the rest of us. Now, our people's budget demands, as I said, we want to stop the cuts and increase the Amazon tax. City Council can, in this budget, increase the Amazon tax rate to eliminate all of the budget cuts and actually expand affordable housing, services, and jobs. Now, the second area that we think we need to move money from, besides Amazon's coffers, is the bloated Seattle Police Department budget. The mayor has proposed a budget this year for the SPD of $359 million, and we'll go to that in the next slide in just a moment. That is more than twice what the city spends on human services, including elder care and homeless services, affordable housing, neighborhoods, arts and culture combined. More than twice what the city spends on all those issues, all those items combined. And if you want to get a sense of how out of control the SPD budget is, you really need to look no further than how the SPD pays its executives, with the mayor's permission, I would add. Let's go to the next slide. That as of 2 months ago, and these numbers haven't changed very much, you'll see on this slide the top executives in the Seattle Police Department. 9 of them, fully 9 individuals in the Seattle Police Department, make more than the top paid US governor in the country. Now think about that. I mean, Governor Andrew Cuomo, who's responsible for New York State and does a great job representing big business interests there, by the way. But he's paid $225,000, and yet there are 9 people in the Seattle Police Department itself who are paid more than the highest US governor. Think about that. When we talk about a bloated police budget, it's this sort of thing that we're speaking about. So our people's budget demand is to defund SPD by at least 50%. And that would give us $170 million that we don't have now to invest in the community. I would note this was the main demand of the Justice for George Floyd uprising, the biggest mass movement protest in US history. And this next slide will show you a quick pie chart of the SPD budget, which our colleague Ted Verdone has put together in the council office. One moment, please. There we go. You can see our proposal would take out $170 million in funding and would leave the remaining, you see the blue on the left, $180 million. Now, Current defunding is 18 million in the mayor's proposal. We're going to take that as well and count that toward the 50%. We also want to note that the mayor's budget includes about $33 million in accounting tricks and other transfers to make it look like she's reducing the budget for the police when in fact she's not. So with that, I'm just going to pause here now and let our community speakers queue up. We are first going to hear from David Parsons, who is the president of UAW 4121, the Union of Academic Student Employees and Postdocs at the University of Washington. Go ahead, David.
Thanks, Jonathan. Can you hear me okay? Okay, thanks, Adam. Good evening, everyone. My name is David Parsons. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the president of UAW Local 4121. We represent about 5,500 academic student employees and postdocs at the University of Washington. Really honored to be here. I know a lot of our members are here tonight, and Joe, in a second, who's one of our local leaders, is also going to be speaking. First, thank you, Shama, and your team for putting on this town hall, and those were really startling numbers that Jonathan just showed. It reminds us of how deeply flawed the mayor's budget is, and I'm struck in seeing those numbers by looking back at her remarks of September 29th, when she first announced her proposal for the 2021 budget. She said the following. She said, "Our revenue is shrinking." She said, "This year we saw hundreds of millions of dollars in lost revenues to the city, and we face similar losses next year." She said, "We can't avoid hard choices in this budget," and this is in exactly the same time as profits have been soaring in ways that Jonathan just described. So the austerity logic behind her remarks is very clear. When the usual funding streams that prop up our city's critical services shrink, the mayor will cut rather than retrieve revenue from those who can most afford it. And she will call this an unavoidable hard choice. This is fundamentally backwards. This is fundamentally dangerous. As union and community members, we need to be speaking up to tell the mayor that for us, this is not a hard choice at all. Take from those who have it, not from those who need it. We've already won a massive victory in passing this tax on Amazon. Now it's time to continue that momentum, continue to push for more progressive taxes, and secure support for working people. Increase the Amazon tax, stop the cuts. Thank you very much, and solidarity.
Thank you, David. That was great. And next, we're going to hear from David's union brother, Joe Segru, who's an academic student employee at the University of Washington and a renter, a member of Socialist Alternative. Go ahead, Joe.
Great. Hey, everybody. Yep, my name is Joe Segru. I use he, him pronouns. As folks have mentioned, I'm a member of UAW, the local 4121. I'm a graduate student in music education. I'm a music teacher, and hopefully this summer I'll be finding a teaching job in public schools, and I'll join a teachers union. So, you know, like David was saying, the work that we do as a union really makes UW run and function. But we also know, like, you know, the majority of us are rent burdened. And many of us were paying over 50% of our income towards rent before COVID. And now we know this is much worse. And we know it's not just worse for us, but all working people in Seattle. And to take a step back, like others have done, and just to further paint this picture of what's going on nationally, it's been reported that 1 in 4 adults have had trouble paying their bills since the coronavirus outbreak started. 1 in 3 have dipped into savings or retirement accounts to make ends meet. 1/3 of families with children are facing food insecurity. And there have been millions of layoffs and furloughed employees nationally in our state of Washington and Seattle. And I bet many of us watching this today, unfortunately fall into that camp. And all of these horrifying statistics have had a devastating effect on working people and youth, particularly Black, Indigenous, and Latino families. And at the same time, you know, as has been talked about, and Jonathan, these statistics were horrifying. Actually, the statistic I had to share was US billionaires' wealth has grown by $845 billion during the first 6 months of the pandemic. And now apparently that's needed to be updated to $1 trillion during this pandemic. And we know that a number of these billionaires live in Seattle, as was also talked about, including the richest man in the world, Jeff Bezos. And while all this is happening, Mayor Durkan's budget doesn't only fail to stop gentrification, displacement, homelessness, but it's actually proposing these massive cuts and essential service, cuts to these essential services that working people need. And this is horrendous for a number of reasons, many of which have already been talked about today. And I'll also add that, we as workers are the ones that actually make the city run. We're the ones that build the city up from the ground, and it's our underpaid labor that has made all of these billionaires so wealthy. And yet we, union members, non-union members alike, are being asked to pay for this crisis that we did not create. And when many of us can't even pay the bills. And a quick side note too, the University of Washington has already experienced budget cuts, and we can certainly expect that in our upcoming contract battle, in UAW contract battle, UW will be looking to undermine our pay and benefits. And a fighting movement is going to be needed to reject austerity there as well. But this isn't to say it's all doom and gloom. We're here for starters, we're engaged. And the people's budget in the past has shown that we can win things working people desperately need and deserve when we fight as a movement. The Tax Amazon movement this past year showed that we can win these things even under a pandemic and also under a recession that the establishment is telling us to pay for. And I've just been thinking about this the last few days, how incredible of achievement that was, and what an indication of power that was, for working people when we fight together. And we don't have to pay for this crisis again if we are organized, if we use a fighting class struggle strategy, and if we put immense pressure on city council to pass things like the proposals in the people's budget. UAW 4121, as well as other unions and rank and file union members, were really actively involved in the Tax Amazon movement. And the movement as a whole showed how we can put pressure on city council to pass things that actually benefit us, and how the labor movement has a crucial role to play in fighting for these demands. And clearly the money to fund these services is here, right? As was just talked about, it does exist. This is something possible for the council to do. They continue to tax big business. They can build on the Amazon tax victory. And they can absolutely cut this massive police budget, but it will take a real fight to win. So what's needed is for all of us to become involved, or maybe more involved, in the people's budget movement. For those of us in unions, we need to get our union brothers, sisters, and siblings on board and active, and do all we can to collectively put pressure on the council to sign on to the people's budget amendments by October 22nd. If we do this, it will be easier for our movement's demands to be heard in front of the council. So, like folks have laid out and I talked about earlier, these are extraordinarily tough times, but we can actually win victories for the working class, and really importantly, inspire others to do the same throughout all of this if we're organized, if we fight together, and if we bring the labor movement into these struggles. Solidarity, everyone, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Adam, I have you on.
All right. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Jonathan, for running us through those slides, and really wonderful to hear the exciting testimony from David Parsons and from Joe, UAW members. I'm going to introduce in a few minutes the speakers we have for Green New Deal demands, and also demands around the Indigenous community. We're going to hear from Matt Remley, who's the co-founder of Mazaska Talks, also a Green New Deal Advisory Committee member. And then we're also going to hear from Colin Moen, who's an apprentice electrician and a member of IBW Local 46. Before we hear from them, though, I want to provide a little bit of context to these demands, and then go through some of the specifics just very quickly in a few minutes. It, of course, comes as no surprise to our movement that Mayor Durkan refuses to fund the Green New Deal programs that are urgently needed to address the climate crisis. We need immediate and large-scale action, and yet at every level, the Democratic Party establishment has refused to do anything more than just pay lip service to our demands. Throughout the years, our office and Shama's political organization, Socialist Alternative, we fought alongside forces in the environmental movement like Got Green, 350 Seattle, and especially the urban native community, who we're going to hear from Matt Remley, who's been involved in these struggles. We built a movement to make Seattle divest from Wells Fargo, which other cities followed shortly after. The urban native community has played an important role fighting for and winning the Green New Deal resolution last year, and then the Amazon tax this year. But obviously the mayor's budget, as we'll see here, and if Jonathan, you could put that slide up, does not follow through on these promises, does not fund Green New Deal. But obviously the movement is not resting on its laurels. We are using the People's Budget Movement to fight back. So as I mentioned, we're going to hear from Matt Remley in a minute, but also before handing it off to him, just to note, we've got People's Budget demands for $20 million to convert homes from gas to electric heat and do weatherization retrofits. We want to fund the Green New Deal Oversight Board, and we want to restore city lights conservation programs. And before we move on to hear from Matt talk about this, I want to give him a bit of a double duty, because we've also got really important Indigenous demands for Indigenous community and urban native community demands. As many will know, our office worked with Matt Remley and hundreds of others in the movement to abolish Columbus Day and replace it with Indigenous Peoples Day in 2014. Every year since then, the community has had to fight to ensure community control. The city has from the start wanted to turn Indigenous Peoples Day into a corporatized, establishment controlled dignitary event, stripped of its roots and struggle in the actual community. So we want, by way of the People's Budget Movement, to fund Indigenous Peoples Day, ensure community control. And we also, there's some really special demands which Matt can speak to as well, around building a crosswalk between the Duwamish Longhouse and a parking lot across West Marginal Way, and also design and placement of signage in Licton Springs. So without further ado, I really want to thank Matt Remley and take it from here, Matt.
Great, thank you, Adam. And I'm very happy to be here, and thank you to the council member for the invitation and opportunity to speak here tonight. And also would like to acknowledge all the union brothers and sisters in here. If I heard right, I believe I'm being followed by someone from IBEW, and that makes me feel good. My dad's actually retired IBEW. So, and then all the others, activists and those fighting for the good fight out there, movement for Black lives, and all the various struggles. And yeah, specifically around the Green New Deal, I was a part of a team of environmental justice impacted communities, as well as labor folks and other environmental justice organizations who came together for a good year to really craft and draft a Green New Deal resolution for the city that centers not only reducing Seattle's greenhouse gas emissions, but focuses on those who are most impacted by the climate crisis, and as well as a focus on workers. And so, we set a pretty ambitious target of 2030 to cut Seattle's greenhouse gas emissions. And thanks to the Tax Amazon movement, which I had the opportunity to participate in as well, to push for funding to accomplish the goals of the Green New Deal. It's one thing to make lofty resolutions and claims to, want to address this issue seriously, and then it's something quite different to then pull open the purse strings and put money towards it. And we know that this is going to cost money to address the climate crisis. In particular, through the Tax Amazon movement, we pushed for the funds to help homeowners to convert from oil, gas to 100% renewables, electric, which we know are IBEW brothers and sisters with a lot of good union jobs right there. And as well as an oversight board. When we passed that ordinance, the Green New Deal ordinance, it was to specifically create an oversight board that would ensure that the city was moving towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And it's been a year now, and the mayor is refusing to fund the staff position for the Green New Deal Oversight Board, which is just 80,000. You would think that she could find 80,000 in a budget to fund a staffing position if she was serious about addressing this climate crisis, and has also refused to seat her 8 positions to that Green New Deal Oversight Board. And we also had asked for stipends for youth and low-income participation in these committees, which she has cut. So thank you to Councilmember Sawant for throwing those in for something to pursue in the upcoming budget cycle. So in terms of Indigenous Peoples Day, thanks again to Councilmember Sawant for not only sponsoring that resolution back in 2014. At that time, Seattle was just the 3rd place in all the U.S. to pass such resolution, and the first one since 1992. What followed was a massive movement across the country, where we now have 130 cities, states, counties, and other jurisdictions that have passed Indigenous Peoples Day resolutions. So we want to see continued funding for Indigenous Peoples Day. It seems like the small amount of money that goes into that yearly shouldn't really be a fight at all, and should just be allotted for community to celebrate on that day. And Adam mentioned about that fight with Wells Fargo, and I do want to point out, following that fight with Wells Fargo, we've continued in that divestment struggle globally, that, like the Indigenous Peoples Day resolution, has gone global. And we centered that fight on Chase Bank, who is the largest bank financing the climate crisis. And in terms of wins, I do want to point out that due to the continuous pressure that the movements have put on Chase Bank, they just came out last week announcing that they were now going to align themselves with the Paris Climate Accords and phase out funding fossil fuels. Now, we know we have a lot of work to do still, but to move a massive Wall Street bank like that is pretty significant. Lastly, in 2 other kind of things we'd like to see in the budget, the Duwamish, who are the original peoples of this area, they have a longhouse out in West Seattle on West Marginal Way. And they've been looking for just a simple crosswalk to go from their longhouse to access the Duwamish River across the street. They especially want it to happen now because this upcoming summer is the 20-something anniversary of the revival of the tribal canoe journeys. And they want safety for all the tribal communities that will be coming to Seattle for that. And lastly, last year, I had the opportunity to work with several tribal community elders around protecting Licton Springs, or getting it listed as a historic place here in Seattle. It is the last known sacred site of Duwamish and other local tribes. And we would like to the tribal folks have asked for just appropriate signage, talking about the historic significance and cultural significance of that place. So thank you for the opportunity to speak, Adam. And I look forward to listening to everybody else on here and fighting for all of us to get these wins in the budget. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Matt, and especially for all your years of hard struggle. I just want to, we'll go on to Colin in a moment, but just note that we're always in the People's Budget movement, looking for important struggles to wage. And just to note here, we're sharing a screen. This year, we're going to fight there's a COVID emergency grocery voucher program in 2021 that we feel should be funded. It's going away, but of course the crisis and the economic crisis for thousands of working people is not. So we think that should be funded by taxing, raising the Amazon tax or defunding the police. Every year we also, unfortunately, we can't meet in person, but we have a whole dozens of Vietnamese seniors who each year fight for several $1,000s to allow for group meal and activities, and we'll be fighting for that in this year's budget as well. Let's go ahead right now and hear from Colin Moen, apprentice electrician and member of IBEW Local 46. Colin, go ahead.
Hey, thank you, Adam. Thank you, Councilmember Sawant, for giving me this opportunity to speak. And thanks for the shout out, Matt. Glad to be sharing the stage with such a long-standing organizer. Unfortunately, I'm in my car right now, so hopefully folks can see okay. But I just wanted to talk briefly about why I support this people's budget, and specifically, I'm an apprentice electrician with IBEW Local 46. And I think it's important to kind of note the significance of the demands around the Green New Deal and fighting for funding to convert electric heating homes from gas to electric heating across the city, particularly for folks in the building trades. I think that building trades workers and our unions, we have a huge stake in the climate movement. Like all workers, we have, not just an interest in maintaining a livable planet for our grandkids and our offspring, but beyond that, we'll, be directly impacted by whatever policies get implemented in the transition from fossil fuels to green energy. And it's in our own best interest to, actively take up the demand for a just transition to green energy that puts the concerns of workers like us on the forefront. And it's in our interest to build a really united mass movement around climate justice so that we can have a seat at the table and have a way to directly shape that process. And we've seen for years now, corporate politicians wax poetic about climate change, and they've done virtually next to nothing to address the root of the crisis, because obviously that would require, actually fighting back against massive corporate interests. And so instead, something that I think we see commonly is, we see corporate Democrats making empty gestures around climate change. And the one that's most notable for me recently is that Mayor Durkan has been celebrating, Amazon buying the naming rights to the new climate pledge arena, and also outrageously cutting Green New Deal funding in this budget. Which I think is just obscene. And at the same time, we see politicians trying to shift the blame for the climate crisis on the backs of working people by, perpetuating this myth that we could somehow solve climate change by simply changing our spending habits, rather than, doing what's necessary, which is actually taking action against the top 100 corporations that are responsible for something like 70% of global carbon emissions. And so one thing that, I've seen personally, a result, unfortunately, of this sort of, this hypocrisy from politicians is that, a number of workers within the labor movement, and particularly within the building trades, which lean a bit more conservative, they've become more susceptible to right-wing and corporate misinformation around climate change and the Green New Deal, despite the fact that it is fundamentally in our own interest for building trades to take the lead in fighting for a sustainable transition to renewable energy that places, the concerns of workers at the forefront of the discussion. And yeah, we need a just transition for all workers whose jobs would be impacted by the transition to renewables. It's something that needs to happen. We can't just wish away the fact that, we need to transition away from fossil fuels. But we also can't leave that process in the hands of corporate politicians who've been selling out workers for years, right? So, unions, building trades unions need to really actively fight in that process. And so, the demands in this people's budget, I think, are a really positive step in that process. We can use these demands to build solidarity within the labor movement, particularly the demand for funding to transition buildings in Seattle away from gas heating to electric will create quality, high-paying union jobs for people in the building trades. And that should be, an absolute no-brainer for any construction worker to support. since making sure that we have a reliable, steady flow of available work is one of our primary concerns in the building trades. And knowing that there's publicly funded projects that we can count on for work, even in a recession, is an extremely valuable resource for us. And I'll just end by saying, obviously winning fundamental change around climate is going to take a massive fight. And in fact, as others have said, even winning the modest demands in this budget is going to take a big fight. And it's going to require all of us building support among our neighbors, our friends, our coworkers, our union brothers and sisters, because the Democrats on the city council are not going to hand us anything for free. We've always had to fight for every gain that workers in the city have won. I was around for the $15 minimum wage fight, the Amazon tax, the renters protections and rights that Councilmember Sawant's office helped win. And all of these gains that we've won by building grassroots movements that have been, aided and helped led by Councilmember Sawant's Socialist Council office. So I'm really glad to see everyone here that's ready to join that fight and get organized. I'm looking forward to working in solidarity with everyone here in the People's Budget Movement and with Councilmember Sawant's office as well. So thanks for having me.
All right. Well, thank you, Colin. And again, thank you, Matt, for joining us to talk about Green New Deal demands, urban, native, and community demands as well. We're going to go on to talk about the next batch of people's budget amendments in affordable housing, anti-gentrification, and renters' rights. We're going to hear from first a Nicholsville speaker, Christopher Anderson, a resident of Nicholsville, from Bia Lacombe, a renter and member of Socialist Alternative, from Violet Lavatai, the executive director of the Tenants Union of Washington, and from Kate Rubin, executive director of B Seattle. So it's a really exciting lineup. But before we do, we're going to go through, again, briefly, some of the political motivation and then the amendments themselves. Obviously, we've seen, the mayor's austerity budget. It cuts deeply into funding for affordable housing. $49 million from the Office of Housing, $30 million away from what was promised last year to address displacement and inequality. It uses the Amazon tax we won to fill budget holes instead of building affordable housing. Fails to fund tiny house villages, and it fails to fund renter organizing and eviction defense. And just as it comes as no surprise, the failure to follow through on Green New Deal promises, it's no surprise that our housing, homelessness, and renter rights demands have also, not been followed through on by the mayor. But we've also, in these exact areas, seen some of our most important demands and victories of the People's Budget Movement since its start. And this should give us a lot of inspiration and hope for our ability to win in this budget season. In 2014, we won authorization and funding for homeless encampments, and that was the first time the city of Seattle did that. And we'll hear from residents of Nicholsville, as I noted earlier, who were a driving force behind that victory. This year, we see the demand for $12 million for tiny house villages to be expanded. That's urgently needed, of course, and that includes self-managed tiny house villages. Every year in the People's Budget Movement, we've battled to stop the sweeps, as inhumane, ineffective, wasting millions, just sweeping people from one street corner to the next. The People's Budget Movement, we came together, as Shama noted, with activists of color to block the $160 million North Precinct, the bunker, and demand 1,000 homes to be built instead. We didn't win the full $160 million for 1,000 homes, but we won $29 million, with faith activists playing a critical role in that victory. As a precursor to the Amazon tax in 2018, we had a successful all-night city hall occupation and die-in the next morning as part of our People's Budget demand to stop the sweeps, tax big business to build affordable housing. And over the years, as we'll hear about from Violet and from Kate, we've won millions for renter organizing, eviction defense, and other urgent needs for working class renters, poor people, and our homeless neighbors. Now, this year, things are different because of COVID. They're even more urgent. We see a tsunami of evictions coming, and in the midst of a pandemic, no less, as thousands accumulate debt, and many already have been economically evicted after having been laid off or lost significant income and accumulating thousands in debt. The homelessness crisis has been exacerbated, as we know, and rents and housing prices are way out of reach for most working class renters and the few remaining working class homeowners. We faced an affordability crisis, years of mass gentrification, long periods of wage stagnation, while corporate developers, landlords, and management companies had made loads of money. So we need to organize and we need to fight. Let's go ahead and let's see these people's budget demands that people can just note down and digest. Build 8 more tiny house villages. We've got, and if you could go back there real quickly, Jonathan, funding self-management encampments, 24-hour shelters. There's a demand to purchase Holiday Inn for emergency COVID shelter for 100 people, which should be transferred into long-term permanent supportive housing, and of course, stop the sweeps and funding for the tiny house villages and Share Wheel Hygiene Center. Go on to the next slide, if you will, Jonathan. As we talked about, we want to restore that 49 million so we can build more affordable housing. And then the last slide before we open it up to our community speakers is about funding renter organizing. 500,000 for renter organizing. I believe it's 750,000 for eviction defense attorneys. That means everybody facing eviction can have the right to an attorney. We want to cancel utility payments for working people who have lost income. We can't, through Seattle right now, to our knowledge, or at least through this people's budget movement, cancel rents, mortgage for people who've lost jobs or income, but we can, as a public utility, Seattle City Light and SPU, cancel utility payments. And of course, we want to study what's needed to establish better power dynamics between renters and landowners. So without further ado, let's go ahead and start with our first housing speaker, Christopher Anderson, a resident of Nicholsville. Take it from here, please, Christopher. And Christopher, I believe you're muted if you're...
Thank you.
No problem.
Appreciate that. All right, so I live here at Cher's Bunkhouse in Rainier Valley. I want to thank everybody for letting me speak for Cher and our brothers and sisters at Nicholsville. We've been a part of the People's Budget Town Halls since they started, both as supporters and as those succeeding in passing our priorities in it. It's the People's Budget where Nicholsville Tiny House Villages, Seattle's first tiny house villages, got city support. It's the People's Budget that made sure Wheels Low Barrier Women's Shelter got funded fairly. And it's the People's Budget that repeatedly defended Cher's indoor shelters from proposed defunding by Mayor Durkan. This year, we hope that the People's Budget finally leads to city funding Cher Wheels 10 City 3. It's operated successfully for over 20 years without city funding. If we can get funding, there are a lot more homeless people who will be safe this winter. That's crucial because the truth is that even after every shelter bed is full in Seattle, more people are sleeping outside in awful conditions than in shelters or tiny houses or sanctioned tent cities. That's why 99 homeless people have died outside or by violence this year in King County. It's neglect. When we're fighting together, though, we win. And that's what the People's Budget Town Halls have accomplished again and again. We have to stand up and speak truth to power, or those with wealth and power will just walk all over us. A great example is the navigation team. It's stunning to watch our mayor fight so hard and bitterly to keep such a discredited effort going. Anyone who's been homeless knows that the navigation team has little credibility. Anyone who's been homeless knows that they have much less to offer than there is need. It's well known that their true goal is to simply move along poor people, ruining their homes in the process, so that those who don't want to see the reality of poverty in Seattle can continue in their blindness. Even after the city council voted to eliminate the navigation team, it looks like it's back under a different guise. The new compromise makes the same promises of providing shelter or housing, or even though there's not enough shelter or housing, by thousands of units. City money spent on the new outreach team would be better spent in directly funding shelters and authorized encampments. Self-managed, democratically organized, and empowered shelters and encampments like those facilitated by Share Wheel and Nicholsville are the cost-effective approach to providing shelter with dignity. All of our share shelters have been operating 24 hours a day during the COVID crisis, and we need to keep doing that through the next year. The City Council is taking up the 2021 city budget right now. Additional funding for Share, Wheel, and Nicholsville has been provided by City Council members Sawant and Morales. We need a third council sponsor now and 5 council votes in support of these proposals. To fund the 24-hour shelters for Share and Wheel in 2021, to fund Tent City 3, and to fund fixing up the vacant hygiene center for Share participants to wash their blankets, take showers, and wash their clothes, and to fund our allies, Nicholsville, in facilitating their tiny house villages. Again, what's different about what we're proposing is that our operations are democratic. The community elects its leaders and decides its direction with weekly elections and gatherings. Our community is not corporate. We don't have executive directors. It's not a top-down operation, we're bottom-up. Our community values its privacy, and we take seriously that data gathering is a servant of the people, not a justifier of bureaucratic BS. We know that it's our choice to share personal information and that no one can force us. We'd rather maintain what we have ourselves than to have someone do our housework for us. We're homeless, not helpless or compromised. Being empowered and part of the community of equals isn't important to everyone. It also requires sobriety, nonviolence, and respect for others. That isn't for everyone, and that's fine. We think there should be a variety of options for homeless people, not just one corporate model repeated over and over. If you think there's a place for an empowered community to help survive and solve homelessness, please support us this budget season. Encourage other city council people to join Shama Sawant in supporting pandemic funding for Share and Wheel's indoor shelters. Support self-managed tent cities and tiny house villages, and help start a hygiene center we can use downtown. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much, Christopher. And after we hear from our community speakers, we are going to go on to a few action steps. So all of the, the 120 plus people watching on a few different live stream platforms can know exactly how to most effectively pressure City Council to win these demands. Let's go ahead and hear from Violet Lavatai, Executive Director of the Tenants Union of Washington State next. Thanks. Take it, Violet.
Thanks, Adam. Thank you, everyone. I'm just so happy to be here tonight. We know that this is trying times, and what I'm here to speak about is the asking City Council members to really invest back into the communities. If you don't have housing, you don't survive on the streets. And also asking to invest back into Share and all of our homeless encampments. I think right now what we're looking at, if they don't step in to help, there will be more people on the streets. And so what we're fighting for is more funding to help with all of these housing that we need so desperately now. We see it in our hotline and in some of the work that the tenant union. I also would like to really talk about what would this funding help, and we need tenant services right now. I also want to say it would help fund other tenant advocates like Be Seattle. And we're asking that they fund Be Seattle and all these amazing housing advocates because we really need the help. We're overwhelmed with helping the tenants, and we don't want anybody to go by the side of the road. And we're asking, thank you, Council members Shama Sawant, for really putting out asking for more funding. We really, really need it. And I think right now is saving our housing, saving shelter over people's heads. That is so vital right now. There's a fear of tenants all across our state right now that they're experiencing eviction. And so right now, we're happy that we have a council member who is going out there and saying, hey, we need more funding. We need to invest into Black and Brown communities. We need to really work hand in hand on saving people's housing. This housing, this funding would help advocates who are already in housing, like B Seattle. And the reason why I bring up B Seattle is because they're doing the work out there, but they need the funding behind them. I always believe in asking all of our advocates, our organizers, and really thankful that we have a council member, Shama Sawant, who is leading the way in getting these funding back to Black and Brown communities, back to helping people save their homes. And so what would this funding do if we really ask for it and demand it? It's a drop in the bucket. We have a rich billionaire who lives in the state of Washington, but we still have a homeless problem. We still have issues surrounding disparity in housing. And if they say, well, he didn't do anything, yes, he did. He's part of the problem. And so when we don't hold these billionaires accountable for not paying their share, their fair share of taxes, then there's something wrong. And that's what we're asking, that they pay their fair share of tax. And I just believe that once they do that, there will be more people in housing. It's cheaper to create housing for people than to leave them on the streets. And so thank you, Adam.
Well, thank you so much, Violet. And yeah, without much ado, why don't we go ahead and move right over to Kate Rubin, who's the Executive Director of B Seattle, who we heard a bit about with Violet. So yeah, take it from here, Kate.
Thank you so much for having me. As Violet noted, I am with B Seattle, and I'm also a renter in District 2. So prior to the pandemic, we as tenant advocates and organizers saw tenants displaced and pushed into houselessness through eviction, rent gouging, and lack of know your rights education. 47% of tenants were rent burdened, which means that we spent more than 30% of our pre-tax income on rent. We were not prepared to shoulder the massive job loss that came with COVID-19. And right now, as hundreds of thousands of renters have lost their jobs and the federal government has failed us time and time again, this crisis has been made even more dire for Seattle renters. Due to Seattle's racist housing history, low-income people of color are more likely to be renters, as well as the first to be pushed out of their homes. According to Census Pulse data, over 16% of renters nationally are not caught up with their rent, with over 25% likely to miss future payments. As it currently stands, we are bracing for a tsunami of evictions. B Seattle and the Tenants Union, along with our coalition partners, including Councilmember Sawant, are currently fighting to cancel rent and mortgages in order for Washingtonians to have a just recovery. But the issues that tenants are facing are not just problems reserved for the future. Currently, during the statewide eviction moratorium, we are working with many tenants facing displacement right now. Landlord harassment, unlivable conditions. Many landlords continue to not follow city regulations and act without compassion for tenants as the pandemic continues. We've worked with tenants in West Seattle who are facing displacement and harassment from their landlords. And in North Seattle, tenants are struggling amidst landlord intimidation and retaliation. These issues are current and they're ongoing, and we need sufficient funds to fight them. Without adequate funding from the Seattle city budget, the incoming catastrophic wave of tenant needs will go unsupported. What will Seattle look like when the moratorium ends and renters are thousands of dollars in debt? We have to fight for renters and provide education and organizing support in order to help keep people in their homes. Tenants are struggling, and an additional $500,000 for tenant services and additional funding for tenant legal counsel is necessary. We need Councilmember Sawant's budgetary amendments to fight evictions and displacement, along with broad community investments as outlined in the Solidarity and People's Budget. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Kate. And let's move right along to Bia Lacombe, who's a renter and also a member of Socialist Alternative. Bia, take it from here.
Hi there. Yeah, thanks everyone, all the community members who've spoken. Thank you, Councilmember Sawant and everyone at the council office. As a renter in Seattle and a member of Socialist Alternative, I know that the People's Budget movement is necessary to fight for the things that we need as working people. For years, successive Seattle mayors and city councils, all of them Democratic Party politicians, have watched as working class renters and homeowners have been ravaged by skyrocketing rents and housing costs, economic evictions and displacement and homelessness. Even before the pandemic, working people were reeling under the impact of the worst affordable housing crisis of our city's history. Now, amidst a resurgence of COVID cases, Mayor Jenny Durkan and Seattle's political establishment are trying to make struggling workers, renters, and homeowners pay for the cost of this crisis, which, as many speakers have said tonight, we did not create. The private for-profit housing market has failed. It is the core of racist gentrification in this city. It has built thousands of luxury apartments that are sitting empty while tens of thousands of working families are pushed out of the city, face longer commutes, and displacement from their communities. Black and brown working people are impacted disproportionately. For increasing numbers, housing precarity has resulted in outright homelessness. Vicious racist gentrification, like Kate was talking about, has been pushing Black and brown communities out of Seattle for decades, and these communities will likely face the brunt of the millions of predicted evictions in the coming months. Earlier this year, nationwide grassroots organizing allowed us to win moratoriums on rent, but let's keep in mind that our movement has been fighting for more than just moratoriums. We have made a call for the establishment to cancel rent for those who've lost jobs and income during COVID. Moratoriums are not going to be enough. Many working class households are behind on rent payments, mortgages, and utility payments. And because rent hasn't been canceled, once the moratoriums are lifted, there's going to be an enormous wave of evictions, unless renters get organized seriously towards a rent strike to win the cancellation of rent, mortgage, utility, and late payments. The cancel rent movement is going to be absolutely critical to prevent the cruel wave of evictions. But it also means that we believe that corporate developers, cash-rich big landlords, and exploitative banks and property management corporations should pay for this crisis, not ordinary people. Banks like Goldman Sachs reported an almost 50% increase in revenue compared to the same time last year. Big banks and billionaires are raking in cash while working people are faced with looming evictions in the middle of winter. If we don't fight to win the cancel rent demand, effectively, we're just going to be bailing out the rich guys. As a Socialist Alternative member and renter, I'm organizing with the People's Budget movement because this movement is committed to fighting and winning to make a material difference in the lives of working class people. We launched this movement in 2014, the first year Councilmember Sawant took office, and every year since then, the People's Budget campaign has won significant victories for our homeless neighbors, for affordable housing, and for renters' rights. Austerity budgets are being proposed across the country. When working people are facing the most desperate situation, the most severe economic depression in 150 years, the political establishment is cutting programs. We need an all-out fight in Seattle against the political establishment in order to win real material gains for working people. We can show that another world is possible. It's that belief that another world is possible that drives me to be a fighting socialist. So join us in the fight for a socialist world. Thanks.
All right, thank you so much, Bia. Thank you, Violet, and Kate, and Christopher, for your really powerful words and on the fight for affordable housing, against gentrification, and for renter rights. We're going to move on to our last few speakers, and in reality, a very important set of budget demands, which are related to defunding the Seattle Police and an elected community oversight board. It's important, before we move on to the speakers, to just note that defunding the Seattle Police Department has been a People's Budget movement demand every single year since Councilmember Sawant first took office in 2014. the people's budget has consistently spoken out against the millions of dollars in overtime, some cases adding up even to more than 24 hours a day, which just shows the absurd and scandalous degree of the lack of accountability. We've rose up against the millions that are wasted repressing peaceful protesters, and this summer especially going on the offensive against protesters. And against sweeping homeless people, as we've heard, from one street corner to the next, wreaking havoc on our poorest and most vulnerable neighbors. Last year, as many who participated will remember, the people's budget and our council office fought hard with Decriminalize Seattle, Creative Justice, Community Passageways, and Corner Greeters, and we won $522,000. That's over $500,000 away from the police to fund these restorative justice programs instead. And we won this in spite of real dogged opposition from some of the Democrats on the city council. Now we've seen, of course, as has been noted, a failure of the Democratic Party establishment in cities throughout the nation to break with their neoliberal approach of putting millions towards a militarized police force, which in the context of the extreme inequality, mass displacement, and systemic racism can only take on a repressive character. So this is one of our main reasons each year for voting no on the overall budget, which is each year a big business budget, in spite of the people's budget victories that our movement wins each year. This year, of course, the demand to defund the police has taken on a whole new meaning. Of course, it was the main demand of the Justice for George Floyd uprising, which is the biggest mass protest movement in US history. Now, we saw city councils all across the country, nearly all Democrats, promise to take up this demand. Some, like New York and LA, saw their budgets reduced by significant amounts at the height of the movement, though it should be noted still nowhere near 50%. Similarly, this was when our movement won the Amazon tax, also on the strength of the George Floyd protests and the 20,000 signatures we gathered at those protests in just 10 days. But now the street movement has almost entirely ebbed. Democrats in all cities, including Minneapolis and Seattle, are breaking their promises to defund the police departments by 50%. They're refusing to use that money, those millions of dollars, to fund Black and brown, working class, and poor community needs. They're refusing to reverse the years of bloated police budgets and executive pay and neglect of working class communities. Now, of course, Seattle City Council is a case in point. 6 Democrats plus Shama as the only socialist promised to defund the SPD by 50%. But when it came to action, not one of those 6 Democrats supported Councilmember Sawant's summer people's budget legislation to defund SPD by 50%. It would have been $85 million for the rest of 2020. Instead, we saw the SPD for the rest of 2020's budget reduced by less than 1%, or $3 million. Even though the SPD's budget has grown by 45% since 2012, from 281 million, still a pretty penny, to 409 million last year, or more than 25% of Seattle's general fund, during a period when statistically crime has gone down substantially in the city. Now, I'll just conclude and go to the slides on the budget by saying whether we win defund or not depends on how strong our movement is. But the budget movement this year also matters in the sense that we want to start building momentum for winning a democratically elected community oversight board, not an advisory board, but a board that has the power to hire and fire, to set policies and procedures and penalties, in which itself can be held accountable directly by voters if they fail to hold police accountable. Nationally, we've actually seen polls show quite a strong support for such elected community boards. And in Seattle, of course, the need is crystal clear. With the brutal repression of protesters this summer, Seattle spent $6.3 million in overtime alone in the first 12 days. And of course, we've seen the continuation of abusive treatment of protesters over many years, resulting in the ongoing Department of Justice consent decree. Just since Mayor Durkan took office, 8 community members have been killed by police with 0 officers prosecuted. And of course, Jonathan earlier went over the absolutely egregious overpay that we see among the police department. So if we could go to those slides right now, we'll just note here, 170 million is the defund that is actually the movement's demand to fund working class Black and brown community priorities. We want a democratically elected community oversight board, and we want to transfer community service officers out of the SPD. Now with that introduction to this important defund SPD and democratic elected community review demands, let's go ahead and hear now from a powerful member of the community, Reverend Robert Jeffrey Sr., senior pastor of New Hope Missionary Baptist Church. Reverend Jeffrey, take it from here, please.
Thank you, Adam. And greetings to you and all of those involved in this discussion. Over the past decades, the African American community, along with other minority communities and their allies, have repeatedly called for economic, housing, and police reform in Seattle. In response to our calls, we've marched, we pleaded, and we begged for such reform for decades now. In response to all our efforts, we have been targeted individually, collectively. We've been marginalized by the newspapers and by officials in control. We've been terrorized and ultimately displaced, driven out of the central area. However, even in light of the federal condemnation of the historic police misconduct, even in light of the federal condemnation of that historic misconduct, the city of Seattle and its police force has remained, continues to remain resistant to reform. And even defiant of any call to look introspectively into its failed policies as it relates to Black and brown people in the Black and brown community. Recently, the head of the police guild attempted to blame the outcry for reform for the resignations and police officers leaving Seattle and the retirement going up. I think that calling the protesters criminal and calling what we're doing continuing to do to ask for reform as riotous and criminal. This is the heart of what our problem is in Seattle, and the part of what the policing problem is in Seattle. Just a stubborn resistance to change. This is outrageous. However, it is simply a continuation of the blame the victim defense used over and over again in Seattle and across the country by out of control, racist police departments, and in many instances, city governments who condone this racist and out of control behavior. This is all allowed to continue unabated because of a national obsession in this country with criminalizing minority communities, using illegal drugs as their pretext. I think everybody should read the book Chasing the Storm by Johann Hart, which talks about all of this and how this is used as a racist ploy to control Black and brown communities and Black and brown people and to criminalize them. This has to end. The whole structure of the Seattle Police Department is built on this assumption, and this has to end. We need sane, safe, responsible, and socially interactive policing. And this can only be done by changing the police budget paradigms. We listen to how much people make. I mean, I'm not against people making a living, but I think that I am against paradigms that create the notion that violence and perpetuation of violence against Black and brown people is necessary to the point where you pay people exorbitant amounts of money in order to make sure that they are there to exact that violence. I think that in itself is criminal. We have to re-examine these paradigms and then decide after re-examining where the money should really go, where humanely this money should go. In addition, we need community input into all police actions that directly impact communities of color. We need community people to review the police. They work for us. They don't work for the corporations, the city. They work for everybody in the city who pays taxes and who is here. They work for communities. They're not our bosses. We're their bosses. And we can't allow this unresponsive attitude, this attitude of disrespect and this attitude that we are not responsible to the people that we serve to continue. We need community people reviewing all actions by the police. Just as if somebody works for you, you review their actions. We need people elected by the community itself to review these actions, democratically elected. This is the kind of thing that has to happen in order for us to be able to move forward. So in closing, I just think that I agree with Councilwoman Sawant in her goals and objectives, and hopefully together, if we continue to fight together as a collective with all of our different needs and our different ideas about how humanely a city ought to be run, hopefully we can win. Because if we don't win, as has been said before, I mean, the injustice will continue. The murders will continue. Corporate greed will continue. People will continue to be put out of their apartments and into the street. Homeless people will continue to have no hope. And I just think that the people in power should join this conversation. This is a conversation that we ought to all have together. How can we have a humane community? And how can we have a humane government? Without that conversation, I think we're all in trouble. And I know that some of the corporate leaders think that they could run from city to city and state to state to get away from this. But this is a conversation going on all over the world. This is a conversation going on about displaced people all over the world. This is not going to end. And it's not going to stop because you move from Seattle to Bellevue or because you move from Bellevue to Everett. This is not going to stop. Displacement, the callous destruction of human potential, it's over. People are woke. And I think that this robber baron attitude and this robber baron mentality that has been fed and being fed by this obsession with the fear that corporations will abandon us if we make them act responsibly. I think that that has to end too in Seattle. And we all have to come sit at the table and come up with appropriate measures. And I think that this budget, as being presented by Councilwoman Sawant, is that. So I'm totally in support. So
All right.
we
Well, thank
fight,
you.
we win.
Thank you so much, Reverend Jeffrey, for those sober but inspiring words also. I'm really grateful and honored to now introduce Castile Hightower, who is the sister of Herbert Hightower Jr., who was killed by Seattle police in 2004. Castile, go ahead and take it from here, please.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you, Councilmember Simon, for having me here tonight. Hi, everyone. My name is Castile Hightower. I currently work in Seattle, have grown up in and lived in Seattle on and off for over 20 years, but now live in Linwood because the rent and home prices are too high. In 2004, my brother Herbert Hightower Jr. was shot and killed by Seattle police. At the time of my brother's killing, we were given multiple inconsistent stories by SPD. They initially advised us that as he was experiencing a mental health crisis, what caused them to shoot him in the chest was him walking towards them with one kitchen knife. They stated they were apologetic that they had forgotten to bring with them any non-lethal weapons. They then stated my brother wasn't walking, but running towards them when they shot him. They changed the story once again to include that they had tried to speak to him prior to shooting him, and because he kept walking, they shot him in the chest. The number of kitchen knives also changed from 1 to 2. They also changed their story regarding non-lethal weapons and were no longer apologetic about not having any non-lethal weapons and stated they felt they had no choice but to shoot my brother in the chest. A man experiencing a mental health crisis surrounded by armed police officers. The media chose to take the word of the police and paint my brother as something he was not, making him seem more aggressive than he was and being apologetic towards the police who murdered him. The community at large, including the NAACP, chose to believe the police officer's story and did not reach out to my family at all. From what I understand, the officer who killed my brother was not reprimanded or charged, and no one was held accountable for my brother's death, neither by the community nor the judicial system. The failures of SPD in not handling a mental health crisis both humanely and justly, as well as not holding the officer who murdered my brother accountable, the preceding silence of community leaders at the time, and the harmful rhetoric by the media allowed to go unchallenged. And what I also want to point out, the lack of mental health services made available within the city of Seattle to low-income residents, such as my brother, contributes to not only his life being stolen before the age of 30, but the subsequent and continued refusal to address multiple systematic and institutional failures that have been allowed to continue to this day and are in dire need of change. This, of course, was all before the murder of Michael Brown, Black Lives Matter, and justice for George Floyd. For months now, I have been fighting, and my family has been asking the Seattle Police Department for the public records around my brother's killing. On August 8th, 2020, we submitted a public records request to the Seattle Police Department. On August 10th, we received an email stating we needed an additional 42 days until September 21 due to a system update. On September 21, we received another email from SPD stating they need until October 14th, referencing the same system update. On October 14th, we received an email from SPD saying they needed an additional 22 days until November 5, referencing yet again the same system update. At this time, SPD has delayed a 16-year-old public record from being released for 73 days and is attempting to make it longer. This is unacceptable. How is it possible Seattle police cannot even meet this most basic request? It's clear to me that we need to build a grassroots momentum. I'm working with Councilmember Sawant's office and hopefully other community organizations to demand Mayor Durkan and the Seattle police to release the records. Keep your eyes out for a petition. Please sign it and share it when you get it. But I am not here only to talk about Herbert's murder and what my family has gone through with his killing, the lack of mental health resources that should have been available to him, and now the insult of having to fight just to get the records. Over the summer, we saw the police firing tear gas, pepper spray, and rubber bullets at people protesting peacefully day after day after day. Our movement fought and won a ban led by Councilmember Sawant's office on using those weapons, and they are still using them anyway. This shows a police department that's out of control and totally out of touch with the needs of the community. We don't need another $400 million police budget. We need to put these millions to funding the needs of Black and Brown communities, fully funding schools, building community centers, and providing good paying union jobs for young people, not detention, jail, and a cycle of poverty, evictions, and brutality at the hands of the police. That's why I support defunding the Seattle Police by 50% and why I support the People's Budget demand and Kshama Sawant's legislation to take $170 million or 50% from the Seattle Police right now and fund the needs of the Black and Brown community. We also need to build housing by the tens of thousands like Reverend Jeffrey and the clergy have been advocating for so powerfully. But this is also about democratic community control over the police. We have seen what they did this summer. We have seen almost a decade of Department of Justice oversight and on Mayor Durkan's watch alone. 8 people have been killed by the police and not a single officer has been charged. There is no accountability without democratic control over the police. That's why I also support the People's Budget demand for the city to begin the process of setting up a democratically elected community oversight board with full enforcement powers over the police, including the power to hire, fire, and discipline officers. Thank you again. Please keep your eyes out for a petition for justice for Herbert Hightower Jr. We're asking for the public records right now, but our fight is for real accountability for my family and all the other families who have lost people they loved at the hands of the police. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Castile, so much for sharing that incredibly powerful story. And I really don't think there's a better segue, just noting the gravity of what we're fighting for than to just introduce 2 people, Erica Chen, who's the appeals chair of the Seattle Human Rights Commission, and Tyrone or Ty Grandison, who's one of the co-chairs of the Seattle Human Rights Commission. They're going to read a letter that they put out just yesterday, I believe, yesterday morning, and it really does effectively tie a lot of the People's Budget movement demands together right before we go on to the action steps that I'm sure by now we're all just almost salivating over after hearing so many powerful speakers. So Erica and Ty, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Adam. Thank you to Council Member Sawant. And we're going to take a slight departure given the powerful messages and speakers today. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to represent Seattle Human Rights. And with all the speakers, like it harpens back for me this phrase, if we don't know our past, then we're doomed to repeat it. So I'd like to set some context here. So if we go back to Seattle in the 1950s, racial inequity was even more rampant then than it is today, right? You had housing discrimination and you had racial covenants that kept Black Seattleites largely in the Central District. You have the Black Seattleites leading the open housing campaign from 1959 through 1968. And in response to that sustained protests and sit-ins at the mayor's office, the city created the Seattle Human Rights Commission in 1963. In 1964, the commission drafted the Open Housing Ordinance to ban the practice of racial housing discrimination. Unfortunately, white voters at the time called the ordinance forced housing, claimed that it violated property rights and rejected it. That's the background that we come from. The Seattle Human Rights Commission is the body created in response to the needs of Black people, tasked with amplifying their needs and their messages, and also tasked with doing the right thing, even in the face of resistance from the establishment. So why are we here today?
Well, Ty and I are here today as representatives of the present Seattle Human Rights Commission. We want to make it clear that the goal of our commission is to represent the community. We're not affiliated with any political parties. Our only side is that of the people of Seattle. Our commission is set up to act in an advisory capacity to the mayor, city council, Office for Civil Rights, and other city departments in order to protect the human rights of people who live and work in Seattle. If you haven't already heard, on October 7th, the Seattle Human Rights Commission publicly called for Mayor Jenny Durkan to resign. And if that wasn't the case, then for the city council to remove her from office. If you'd like to read that letter and other letters we've written, you can read them at seattlehumanrights.org/blog. This is the culmination of a 5-month-long process to work with city leadership on ensuring that Seattleites are not harmed and that the budget reflects the moral stance that's befitting a human rights city. We asked her to live up to her campaign promises. We asked her to be better, to do better by the people. And if not, we ask that she step aside. While that's working itself out, we really want to focus on amplifying the voices of community. We want to help you ensure that Seattle passes a fair, equitable, and humane budget that puts the well-being and human rights of Seattleites first. This means stopping sweeps, increasing affordable housing, protecting renters from evictions and foreclosures, creating programs to reduce the income and wealth inequality gap, and defunding SPD by at least 50% and reallocating police budget to effective public safety programs. These and other Seattle Human Rights Commission budget recommendations are outlined in a letter that we published yesterday, October 19th. Our recommendations align with those of the People's Budget. We believe that budgets are values documents. We fund what we value, and as a human rights city, Seattle needs to prioritize and fund human rights. So what exactly are we asking of the community today?
We need people to do what we're doing right now at this forum, to organize, to go back to tried and true methods of letting your elected officials, your council members know how you feel. We also need an executive that acts in your best interest. And sadly, the track record of the current executive is that there's no willingness to actually do that. So we want you to tell your council members that you need an executive that will act on your behalf. And don't stop there. Also tell this to the executive and her team directly. Also organize to make sure that all the tenets of the people's budget are things that we can actually get past. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ty, Erica, and also thank you, Reverend Robert Jeffrey and Castillo Hightower. So Erica and Ty were speaking the language of the people's budget, and that's the language of organizing and movement building. Let's go ahead and hear from Sasha about the calendar of the people's budget, and then from Nick Jones in our office and Reverend Ying about the action steps that we can all take right here, right now. So Sasha, go ahead.
Thank you, Adam, and thanks everyone else who spoke tonight, as well as everyone watching online. Jonathan, if you're able to share the budget calendar. And I'm just going to go through it. Yeah, so Mayor Jenny Durkan announced her proposed budget for 2021 on September 29th, which, as we know, includes over $200 million in draconian cuts to housing, parks, libraries, and the Green New Deal. Our office staff has spent the last 20 days combing through her proposal to discover all these cuts to vital services, and then discussing them with all the communities we have just heard from on what we need and what we can fight for and win. Just 2 days from now, 5 p.m. on Thursday, October 22nd, is the deadline for getting 3 total sponsors. So with Councilmember Sawant's sponsorship, 2 additional sponsors in order for each people's budget proposal to go forward into the discussion for the overall budget. As always, with the people's budget demands, what we can win is directly related to the power of our grassroots campaigning to ensure that the council members feel the public pressure to sign on as sponsors. Of course, the budget process doesn't end on October 22nd, and we will continue to fight every step of the way for a people's budget. But if we get the sponsors now, that puts us in a much stronger position through the rest of the budget process. Reverend Angela Ying and Nick Jones from our office will be speaking after me about how you can help build that pressure, phone calls, emails, and other actions. I'm just going to go through what happens after October 2nd. The next big event is the public hearing on Tuesday, October 27th. The budget public hearing has always been a crucial step in building the people's budget movement every year. Normally, we would pack City Hall with hundreds of people with posters and chants, but of course, during the pandemic, we can't do that. So speaking out in the online public hearing, having hundreds of people repeating the same points over and over again is even more important than ever to show the widespread support and that we are organized and ready to fight to win our demands. We will be hosting an online community meeting at 3 p.m. that day, Tuesday, the October 27th, to help prepare everyone for the public hearing. Public comment sign up starts at 3:30 p.m. and we'll walk you through how to do that during the online community meeting, and the public hearing itself starts at 5:30 p.m. Next, the City Council will discuss and debate the amendments which have gotten at least 3 sponsors at the Budget Committee meetings on the 28th, 29th, and 30th. And at the beginning of each of those meetings will be public comment. We want to take every opportunity to reiterate our demands. So if you're available in the mornings on the 28th, 29th, and 30th of October, please sign up for public comment. And public comment sign up each day will be at 7:30 a.m. and the meeting starts at 9:30 a.m. The next week, October 31st through November 9th, there are no budget committee meetings. This is a crucial time to flood the council members' email inboxes and phone lines heading up to the budget package, which will be presented at the next meeting on November 10th. So November 10th through 19th are the votes on the amendments that have been already included in the budget package, that have not already been included in the budget package. If we aren't able to get the sponsors, the 3 sponsors that we need, for our demands before October 22nd, we can bring them back in at this point to the debate. But once again, our ability to win these votes will rely entirely on how big of a movement we are able to build between now and then. The People's Budget's 6-year strong track record shows that we can win when we get organized. And so November 23rd is when the City Council will vote on the overall budget. Let's make the most of the next 4 weeks to win as much as we can for working people and marginalized communities and put a political marker down that we can build on next year. And if you'd like to take a closer look at this PowerPoint that we have put together for today's meeting, you should see it on your screen now. And Nick Jones from our office will be sharing the link in the chat as well. And he should also be sharing the Facebook link to the online community meeting for the October 27th public hearing. And now I'll pass it off to Reverend Angela Ying and Nick Jones to go over the next action steps for building this movement.
Great. Hello, everyone. I'm Reverend Angela Ying. It's great to see everyone. A special thanks to Councilmember Shama Sawant, her staff, and all of you for joining us this evening. Who is ready to continue to win for the people? Who is ready? I am, and I want to join all of you as we collectively stand in solidarity and power for a people's budget. Because here we know, and we've heard fabulous speakers this evening, that we understand that austerity is no solution to the struggles of all that we face as workers, as BIPOC communities, as marginalized communities, as renters, as everyday people, and human beings that deserve better. Austerity budgets, budget cuts, and then I would say that are immoral and inhumane, that put the burden on economic crisis on the ordinary people and all of us, doesn't work. So we don't have to accept it, and we will not accept it if we work collectively together through this. Now, as Sasha has says, we have a short window, 4 weeks, that we can make this happen. And we know that we have an amazing track record, that we have won so many things as we work together. So we've heard what's possible from all the presenters tonight, and hopefully all of you out there have these lively discussions and can continue to be together as we work in solidarity. So let's take some time with not only our words, but put it into action. For as Sasha says, we can do this in the short time. And I'm just grateful for all the amazing speakers that inspire me. It is imperative that we put maximum pressure on our council members now. And so I'm going to pass it on to Nick Jones, who will talk with everyone through our first step. Nick, take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Reverend Ying. My name is Nick Jones. I'm a community organizer in Councilmember Sawant's office. I'm excited to be here with all of you today. We're going to get into kind of the next steps of what we can do to concretely build this people's budget fight that we're all here for. And I appreciate the Reverend's words, keeping the energy up. So Sasha, someone from our office should be sharing a link in the various chats to, it should be a MailChimp link is what it should say, but it's a mail form that we can all use to right now, right here, send hundreds of emails to the city council, letting them know that all the people here support a people's budget. They should listen to our demands and pass the things that working class people, marginalized communities need in Seattle this budget season. Not more austerity, not more of the status quo. And I'm going to take a moment to just kind of walk through that process with everyone. So folks, if you can, let's all send just an email right now. It'd be a great opening salvo for in this movement. And we only have a few days to really force the council to get behind us. And just as an aside, we've already sent over 170 emails just like just today, which I think is hugely exciting. Thanks to everyone if you already sent one that's on this call. But I think we could have a goal of at least getting 300, maybe 500, maybe post in the chat what you think is possible. I think we could go higher. I always want to shoot for the higher targets. And after you send the email, definitely post in the chats as well that you've sent an email to the council, so we can all support each other and see the power of solidarity. I know right now in the pandemic, it can be sometimes very isolating doing kind of political work, but we can all share our actions together right now, which I think can be really invigorating. Sorry, 1 second. Okay. Here we go. I'm going to share my screen. Folks should be able to see it. Here's my handy link form. Should be a link that looks like this. Hopefully everyone has that. Go ahead and just click on it. I'm going to click on it from my end. You should have access to the chats. You should be able to copy and paste. In fact, I will do that to be in solidarity with folks. We will copy and paste into our URL here. My apologies in advance. This doesn't, if I get dropped, I had a little bit of issues earlier with this. But everyone should be here now. Everyone on this call should be here. And this is the link we want. Email council members now. Everyone should click on this. It should, I don't know if your computer does this. Mine's going to ask me to open it with Gmail, which I think is ideal. Hopefully for some folks, it might just open. Use whatever mail program works for you. And nice, it's loading. All right, we didn't get dropped. Victory on the people's budget call. It should load an email that looks just like this. Mine is not populating. There we go. Should look like this. As you can see, we've kind of drafted this email to bring forward the people's budget demands like we've all been talking about tonight. You'll see this address up here, council@seattle.gov. That goes to every council office. So when we hit this together, we are going to blanket the city council offices and demands for a people's budget, which I think is very exciting. You can feel free to leave your own extra message at the end if you want to, or at the beginning, if you want to add a little personal spice. I think I'm just going to write My name, Nicholas Jones, renter in District 2. You don't have to do that, add your own personal style. And then you should just be able to hit send, bam. And now we have just sent a ton of emails to the city council that they're all going to find tomorrow morning and create a ton of pressure for the people's budget. Small thing, but it really does add up. I check emails in the council office and I can tell you, opening an inbox of hundreds and hundreds of emails saying, we demand an end to austerity. We demand we use the Amazon tax to fight for affordable housing. We demand to defund the SPD to invest in POC communities. That has a massive impact. So everyone should be doing that right now. And hopefully everyone has been able to. I am going to now pass it back over to Angela. And definitely if you sent it, put it in the chat. Oh, let's hit 500. I think that's possible. Let's get 500 emails out tonight. Let your, if you know folks that also support these demands, definitely give them that link as well. Get everyone you know to be part of this movement, because that's the only way we're going to win. I'll pass it back over now to Angela.
Thanks, Nick. Also, Adam put it into the chat so that you don't feel left out. Let's keep those emails being sent. It's so very, very important. And just to share with you, I've been mobilizing with clergy and faith leaders. We actually have put together a letter ourselves. I know a number of unionists and others are also doing their own letters. So I just think that's going to be just that as powerful as well. So sending the individual letters as well as group letters is going to be huge. So let's keep the power and the pressure for being collectively working towards a people's budget moving. I just want to share with you a couple of things. We plan to have a press conference with the clergy and faith leaders. I've been working with hundreds of clergy and faith leaders to have it signed, but I want to let you hear a little bit about it so that you can get inspired with your people as you continue to work, because everyone can make a difference. And in part of the letter, we have different points that include providing restitution for the land taken from the New Hope Missionary Baptist Church in the adjoining properties in the 1970s by the city of Seattle. They actually stole land from the church. We're asking to increase funding for affordable housing and social services, especially to enable African families to return to the Central District. We're asking to fund programs to prevent evictions and foreclosures for renters, working class homeowners, and struggling small businesses. We're asking for funds for more tiny house villages, not less, and the most effective, because they're the most effective, humane support for homeless neighbors, and to stop the inhumane and ineffective sweeps of our homeless neighbors, as so many other speakers have shared. We're asking to fund the Green New Deal, as Matt and others have shared earlier, as well as allow us to have good union jobs and free transit. And we're asking to raise the necessary funds for these social investments by reallocating money from the police department budget, whose budget has ballooned, as we have found out, 45% since 2012, without improving the safety of our people at all. And we want to increase the just enacted Amazon tax on major corporations, because many of whom are greatly profiting, as we heard, trillions of dollars in benefiting financially during the pandemic. As a faith leader, and I know many others join me, the budgets are moral documents reflecting the values of the city. And as faith leaders, we cannot support a city austerity budget that imposes the burden on the poor and the most vulnerable. Rather than have the wealth carry their fair share, especially during the pandemic, and we need to provide more funding that we can have for the people. We do not want to have more funding for the police, who injure, lock up, and as we heard, kill our youth and young people and our adults. We call on you, the council, to boldly lead alongside us to right the historical and current wrongs, including the funding of social needs in our communities and demilitarizing the police. Since the George Floyd murder, we've had tens of thousands of Seattle residents that have joined, and we are all a part of this, calling around the world to demilitarize the police, shift the resources into our community, and fund urgent community needs. We have marched, we have demonstrated peacefully, and we have spoken out in city council meetings, and we will continue to do so. We urge the council to listen to all the people who have shared with you their personal stories, their collective community concerns, and what must be done to address the injustice for all. In this budget debate, you, the council, we will say, will be judged by your courage and leadership or lack of. So let's hear it. We want to make sure the arc moves towards justice and doing what is right. So stand together. Let's make this people budget win and work. Thank you. Now I want to introduce to you who you've heard earlier, but he wants to speak on this matter. Joe, we want to bring Joe Sugru back, a labor activist and member of UAW 4121 and of Socialist Alternative. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you very much, Reverend Ying, Nick, everybody who's been attending this town hall. This has been an extremely inspiring and important event, hearing from a number of community members about how we can build this people's budget movement together, a series of demands that people have talked about, and how we can fight for these demands together in solidarity with one another. So Reverend Ying introduced me again. My name is Joe, proud member of UAW, Local 4121, and I'm a music teacher. And I want to take a moment to speak to the union sisters, brothers, and siblings on this call. As union members and organizers, we know that our power as workers lies in solidarity. We know that when we're fighting to win a good contract in our workplaces, it takes getting organized, standing together, and demanding the things we need. And this budget is the same. These demands were talked about by Reverend Ying and others, but just to reiterate, our communities need a Green New Deal, and a strong Green New Deal at that. We need affordable housing and to cut the police budget. We need to establish a democratically elected community oversight board with full powers over the police. We need to fund homeless services and end this regressive tax system where working people are the ones footing the bill as the billionaires and the ultra rich get richer and richer and don't even pay close to their fair share. They need to be taxed to fund these social services, and we need to be organized and put forward our demands standing alongside each other. And there's more we need to fight for as well. As union organizers and labor activists in the people's budget struggle, we've also been circulating a sign-on letter similar to the one that has just been discussed. And this letter should be posted in the chat on whatever platform you're watching on. So if you belong to a union, take a moment right now, this very moment, to add your name to this letter as a serious demonstration of our solidarity in action. So while folks are signing on to that letter, I just want to thank everybody. Thanks for having me speak at this event today, and onwards to fighting for a people's budget that actually reflects what working people need and deserve. Solidarity, everybody. And now we can go back to Nick.
All right. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Angela and Sasha, and everyone on this call, everyone watching. It's integral that we are all here building this movement if we want to be able to win these things that we've all discussed and agree that we need in the people's budget today. So yeah, just a few things. Hopefully folks are finding those letters in the chats, being able to send those emails. Sorry, I had a quick thing I needed to read. And for folks, if the sign-on letters are not appearing in the chats, I will repost them right after I finish speaking here very briefly. The last thing I wanted to kind of bring up is right now the city council is still discussing, as Sasha said in the calendar, the city council is going through their budget committee deliberations. The next one is tomorrow morning at 9:30. And the way to get on public comment is they'll post a form online. I usually find it by just going to like Googling Seattle public comment. It should pop right at the top, and the form goes live 2 hours before the budget committee. So tomorrow at 7:30 a.m. I know it's very early, but it is worth it for us to make our voice heard in this movement. And so if folks can, tomorrow morning at 7:30, pop online, just Google Seattle public comment, fill that form out. We want to have all the voices here tonight be part of those deliberations so the city council knows that we are a serious movement. Fill that form out and then give public comment at 9:30 if you can. Again, that is tomorrow morning. Yeah, should be able to find all that online. Hopefully folks are able to. Additionally, we're going to blank it up with emails. folks can make calls before Thursday as well. You should definitely do that. To call the city council, everyone has very similar numbers, which makes it very easy to call city council offices. And I'll type this in the chat as well when I'm done speaking, but it's 206-684-880, and then whatever district they represent. Mosqueda and Gonzales being citywide are 8808 and 8809. However, everyone else should be pretty easy to figure out. Like Shama is 206-684-8803 because she represents District 3. And again, I'll post it in the chat. But folks should definitely make those calls, make those emails, get folks involved. If you know people in the labor movement, get them to sign that letter and share it with their union siblings. If you know folks in the faith community, get them to sign that letter. The numbers on that are growing rapidly, but we need them to be way stronger going forward. So with that, hopefully folks have quite a few things on their plate now for next steps. We have a lot to do. Again, thank you all for being here, and I will send it back to Adam for closing remarks. Thank you.
All right, and yeah, there's been so much said. I want to appreciate everybody for their patience. Everybody who's attending, and so yeah, on behalf of Councilmember Shama Sawant and all of our staff, thank you, of course, to all the panelists, all the speakers for your powerful words. To everyone for watching. We obviously have a lot of work to do, so let's get out there and fight for a people's budget and solidarity.